Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream History by podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Steve Mason. And today we're going to be talking about the historical Josephus Flavius and his relationship to the Flavian Dynasty. Well, welcome back to the show, Professor Mason. It's good to have you back.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Jacob.
So, what do we know exactly about what Josephus's relationship to the Flavians is? Because he obviously wrote several works, and he wrote the autobiography about himself. He tells us a lot about himself, but some historians have doubts about certain things he says about himself.
Yeah.
And with that being said, what details can be sorted out to know what exactly he said about himself that is reliable versus that which is probably not reliable?
Oh, yeah. Well, when we talk about reliable stuff, I know this is going to sound a little airy-fairy, but bear with me for 1 second. But when we talk about things that are reliable, it's a bit of a trick for historians because on the one hand, you've got very basic things like Bob went down the street, or this army fired on that army, or a war was declared on this day at this time. Those kinds of things they either happened or they didn't happen, right? So when we talk about reliable, if a writer says that didn't happen and it did, or vice versa, we say they're reliable or not reliable. But of course, the problem is that those bare bones of what a certain thing was said or done at a certain moment are not really the stuff of history, right? The stuff of history is why they were done and what they mean, what the motives were. So it may be that an explosion goes off in a building somewhere, and one person says, "Well, that was the freedom fighters really trying to defend themselves against an oppressive regime," and another person says, "Those are terrorists." Just causing trouble and never happy, and not realizing all this regime has done for them, something like that. You see what I mean? So there's no way to talk about reliability in the latter group of issues. And the problem with Josephus, to come back to your question, is that most of his writing is about the latter kind. Why people did things. Not so much exactly when they happened. Most of the time, we can't figure out exactly when things happen anyway. So if he says that a certain ruler ruled for so many years and months and days, and then we have two other accounts that give a slightly different version, is that a big deal? If we say he's not reliable? No, that's not what we're talking about, right? What we're really talking about with, say, the Jewish war against the Romans is why it happened, what the motives were, how he characterizes certain people that were actors, that were players in the war, including the Flavian regime. So I should maybe pause there, Jacob, and maybe for some of your viewers who are not, it's not right in their fingertips who the Flavians were exactly. What we're talking about here is Vespasian. These two guys pictured on my screen here. So that's in the middle is a statue of or a bust of what some people think is Josephus in the Glyptotek in Copenhagen. There's no good reason to think it's Josephus actually, but anyway, I use it just as a placeholder. But the other two are, in fact, statues of Vespasian and Titus. I added the eyes just to make them less creepy or more creepy. I'm not sure, but anyway, Vespasian was emperor from 69 to 79, and his son Titus from 79 to 81. His other son Domitian from 81 to 96. So these are the Flavians that we're talking about. And Josephus was in Rome while Vespasian and Titus and then Domitian were emperors. So the question is, about how he portrayed these people and their actions in the war. But to come back to your question then, I don't think, I realize I dodged it and I prevaricated. That's because there's no simple answer to the question. Like there's no formula we can say, he's 60% reliable, or he's reliable in these cases or not in those cases. For the historian, I think it's a matter of trying to understand how he portrays people. That's the first job. Job one is understanding. And then job two is asking our own questions, probing for certain particular questions and seeing, is he useful here? Is his perspective, does it help? Does he have a valid perspective? Was he there, or does he have good sources? It's never going to be like a God's eye view of, everything that happened and everyone's true characters. This is beyond the scope of any historian. Even with modern figures like Churchill or, Stalin or whoever you want to talk about, John F. Kennedy, there are, of course, any number of books written about these people because there's always something more to add. There's no possibility of somebody just writing the reliable history of these people, right? So anyway, that's a long answer to your question, but a good introduction maybe to where we're going with this today.
So you want to get to the slides?
Yeah, sure. If you're up for that. So let's jump right into it. The basic question that I want to get at today is what is Josephus's view of the imperial power while he's writing in Rome? Because that's a big deal. He's living in the world capital when these guys are in power, and they are the ones, the first two of them, Vespasian and Titus, pardon me, who destroyed Jerusalem, who fought the Jewish war, and Titus led the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the city and the temple. So here's Josephus, a priest, a young priest aristocrat from Jerusalem, who was captured by Vespasian, who now has been freed and lives in Rome. And he writes 30 volumes of history that have a fair bit to say, especially in the Jewish war, about Vespasian and Titus. So what's his view of them? Well, what I want to say in a nutshell, so I can say this right up front so people know where I'm going with this. The very common view is that he looked at them with rose-tinted glasses, that he was some kind of booster or backer of the Flavians, that he was in their pocket, that he was doing their work for them, that he was a kind of quisling, that he was even a spokesman for the Flavian regime, a turncoat against his own people. I'm going to propose today that that's not the case, and that actually he had a much kind of cooler and more distant view of the Flavian regime, because he really wrote as a Judean, a Jewish statesman. And he had his own fish to fry, and they weren't about promoting the Flavian regime. Lots of other people were doing that. He didn't need to do that in Flavian Rome. He had his own thing, and his distinctive contribution was not about boosting the Flavians. It was about presenting the other side of the picture, the Jewish side, and trying to show what he could say about the Jewish character, including his own character, of course, as Exhibit A. Now, to see why this is important, I have to stress that I'm not making this up, that most people take a dim view of Josephus as a turncoat, a Flavian lackey, a publicist for the regime. So I'll give you just a few examples. Already from more than a century ago, that this writer said his surrender to the Romans was a sad compound of cant and cowardice. We don't use these words anymore, but pusillanimity, like weakness, and subservience to his Roman patrons. The very famous German scholar about a century ago said he was the prophet of the new Caesar, and he actually borrowed mostly from an official Flavian account when he wrote his war. The very famous Loeb translator of Josephus a century ago, Henry St. John Thackeray, said he thought he was commissioned by the conquerors to write the official history of the war for propagandistic purposes. Fast forward 60 years or so, and you have Konrad Kinzel writing that he stood on the side of the Romans and no longer with his own people. Now, for more recent scholars, I'm going to blank out their names because they're still active, and I'm not trying here to pick on them or pick a fight with anybody. So I'm not going to name them, but anyone who wants to look them up can find them. I'm sure they've published this stuff, so it's out in the open. But a very eminent scholar says he was besotted with the Flavians. He was a Flavian apparatchik, and he wrote the official version of the war. Another says his depiction of Vespasian is adulatory, and that of Titus little short of sycophantic. That is, just totally enthralled to the rulers of the time. And then in a 2016 companion to the Flavian regime, you have a number of articles that say much the same thing. He's writing the official version. He was a one-time insurrectionist general for the Jews who turned Flavian propagandist. Another says in the course of the war, he changed allegiance and joined the Romans. Still another, Vespasian and Titus are major characters in his war. The references to them are uniformly positive. So you get the idea. And these are all scholarly publications. On a more popular level, there is a view, which some of your readers or viewers will know, that there's a hypothesis out there on the internet and in a few books that the Flavian regime invented Christianity. And that view, as far as I've been able to tell, I haven't explored it very deeply. It's not held in scholarly circles, but I see that it's popular on the internet. That this view also assumes that Josephus was in the pocket of the Flavians, so that he, did their bidding, writing their history, and then they wanted some versions of it even have him involved in sort of creating Christianity. We can leave all that aside. I simply want to point out all of this assumes that Josephus really was working somehow for the Flavians and mouthing their view of things. What I want to suggest today is that this is all not sustainable if you actually read Josephus, if you read it, especially in context. Now, that said, it's not that I think my colleagues are, challenged in any way mentally. They have reasons for for this common impression, right? There are things that they're looking at that give them this view of Josephus. So what are some of those things? Well, mainly it's circumstantial evidence. Simply that he survived his surrender to the Romans. He survived being captured. He served them as a translator, and he later lived in Rome as a free man and a Flavian client. So people then assume, well, he must have been kind of a cowardly guy who was on their payroll. That's just a big assumption, right? And I think a modern one is like, why would you? How could you survive if you weren't somehow, if you didn't work a deal with them somehow, if you weren't serving them? Second, from the 1920s onward, especially, people focused on a reference Josephus made to an earlier Aramaic version of his Greek war. So the war we have is Jewish war, which he wrote 75 to 79 CE, somewhere in there while Vespasian was emperor. He says in there that he's in the introduction that he's putting into Greek stuff that he had already written somewhere, somehow in Aramaic earlier. Well, many scholars seized on that and said, okay, so that must mean that the Flavians told him to write an Aramaic version first, which people took to be propaganda aimed at the Parthian Empire to the east. I think this is highly implausible. He doesn't say he wrote it from Rome, and I see no evidence that the Flavians authorized an Aramaic account from Rome. I think it's much more likely that he's just saying, when I was out in the East, while I was still there, I wrote in Aramaic to some people in the Parthian Empire that I knew, wrote some letters, things like that. And they are accurately informed. And now I want to accurately inform you all who are Greek speaking. So I don't think that assumption holds any water either. Then in halfway through his work, he writes a little digression on the Roman legions, which is quite fascinating, and their training and their equipment and their discipline and all of that. And at the end, he says, why did I write this digression? I wrote it for three reasons. One of the reasons he gives is, anybody who's thinking of revolting from Rome, I want to dissuade you. Well, scholars seized on this and said, aha, he wrote his account to deter any kind of revolution. Therefore, he's writing for the Flavians. But this is a digression. It's halfway through his work, and it's only one of the three reasons he gives for having written it. And it's kind of just an offhand comment. He doesn't need a reason. But the main reason he wrote it actually was to show it's at the beginning of his volume on Galilee, where he was the Jewish general facing Vespasian in the field. So he's actually saying, look, this is what I had to face. I didn't even have a regular army here. And the Romans arrived in Galilee, 3 legions, and here's how the legions train, and they've never been beaten, and they have incredible discipline, and they have all this equipment. And here I was, what should I do? And he's really building up to his surrender story. So he's really explaining that. It's not about flattering the Romans, it's really flattering himself that he lasted so long, trying to give them a hard time. Then scholars look at a few scattered remarks that he makes about Vespasian or Titus, which might look a little bit flattering. I mean, they're at least polite if you don't read them in context. So when he talks about Vespasian, he talks about some of his wise moves as a general. Titus, he presents very much as a very gentle guy, trusting, didn't want to destroy the temple and so forth. And in a big speech that Josephus gives for his own character in book 5 of the war, he talks about how he says to the rebels in Jerusalem, look, there was a spring here that only used to flow intermittently, and now Titus has arrived, it's flowing properly. But so scholars seize on that and say, look at that, that's absolute flattery of Titus. But actually, what he says in this speech is, you should know that the last time this happened was back when the Babylonians besieged Jerusalem 6.5 centuries ago. So you should realize this is a sign from God that you're in trouble. It's not flattery of Titus. It's evidence of God's showing you a sign that your time is up. You should give up. You should surrender. And finally, there's a modern assumption that like a kind of very modern democratic enlightened assumption that the Flavians must have felt just awful for having destroyed the temple, and that Josephus's purpose, therefore, in saying that Titus really didn't want to destroy the temple, it must have been that he was trying to clear Titus of guilt that Titus must have felt for this awful thing that he did. But the problem with that is that the Flavians actually celebrated every opportunity they got for having destroyed Jerusalem. That was the very basis of their claim to power. So Josephus has no business trying to divorce Titus from the very thing he was most famous for in Rome. He was not embarrassed about it. It was celebrated endlessly everywhere, as we'll see in a moment. So there are reasons why my colleagues are not foolish for having thought that Josephus was promoting the Flavians. But the problem is that if you read them in context, you get a very different impression. And so in the remainder of my presentation, I want to do what I think is a little bit of a magic trick, which is to show that things look very different when you read them in context. Context makes all the difference. Josephus wasn't writing for us to read him in little bits of random text here and there. He produced his Judean war in 75 to 79 while Vespasian was emperor. And so he's writing for an audience that already knows, claims to know, a lot about this war from Flavian propaganda, right? He's not writing Flavian propaganda. He doesn't need to. It's everywhere in Flavian Rome. So he is writing not to introduce the war as a new subject. It's everywhere. You can't look anywhere in Flavian Rome and not see signs of what the Flavians themselves are saying about their victory in Judea. So I want to look at three kinds of context in our little chat. One is, what was the regime itself and its enablers? What were they saying about the war in Judea? Right? What were other writers? Most of them are now lost, but we have later, like in Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, Pliny the Elder, we have some indication of what people were saying about Titus and Vespasian. And this provides crucial context for understanding Josephus's claims about them. And then what's the context in his own works? How does he frame his portraits of Vespasian and Titus? So my claim is that if we look at these three kinds of context, what he says looks totally different than if you just plucked it out and read it by itself and said, oh, that sounds like flattery to me. Well, maybe we'll have a different view if we look at it in context. So I'll stop there for a second, Jacob. Shall I continue or what?
Yeah, please continue.
Okay. So the first kind of context, what did Josephus' Roman audience know, or what did they think they knew about this? Because he's going to be challenging what they think they know. That's the point. He's not promoting the Flavians. He's saying, okay, this is what you guys think you know. Let's take a Jewish perspective on this, right? Which is different. So what had happened? What did everybody know? Well, from 66, 67, things are getting rough. From 65, there's a conspiracy against Nero in Rome, led by some senators, the Pisonian conspiracy, and then 66, another conspiracy. And then finally, a civil war breaks out in the spring of 68 CE. And it's led by Iulius Vindex and then Galba, who is a senator, governor. They lead the first big rebellion, and Nero is declared an enemy of the state, and he commits suicide in June of 68. So Galba takes over. He reaches Rome by October, but he's immediately challenged by two other guys, Vitellius, who's also a Western governor, and Otto, who was an old friend of Nero's and also a Western governor. So they're going to fight it out, Vitellius and Otto, fighting it out with old Galba. Galba's about 70 years old. So a big question is, who is he going to be replaced by? And it seems that Otto wished to be his successor. He's much younger, and he didn't get it. He wasn't chosen as successor, so he's got a grievance. And Vitellius has a grievance because the German legions are not happy with Galba. So Vitellius and Otto are already ready to fight Galba, and they initiate a second civil war. Galba is murdered in the Roman Forum in the middle of January already of 69. And then Otto becomes emperor, and then Vitellius challenges him. Vitellius wins by April of 69. So that first round of civil wars, first Galba against Nero, or Vindex and Galba against Nero, and then Vitellius and Otto against Galba and against each other. This is all settled finally by April of 69, and Vitellius emerges victorious. So the civil war is over, right? But way out in Judea, where Nero had sent Vespasian, and he was making steady progress, calming down the situation in Galilee and Judea, he decides finally to launch a new civil war. But he needs a justification for that. You don't just go and begin a civil war for no reason. So his justification for doing this is, he says, well, the others were fighting each other, Romans fighting Romans, but we were fighting foreigners out there, a threat to Rome. We were fighting the external enemy. And they claim that the Judeans had never been conquered before, but finally Vespasian and Titus conquered this new people and brought prestige and wealth to Rome. The Senate rewarded them with memorial arches, one of which is the famous Arch of Titus, but there were others. Cassius Dio refers to several other memorial arches. The Senate awarded each of them, Vespasian and Titus, a triumph, but Vespasian preferred a joint triumph with his son Titus. Why? That's a very interesting question. We'll discuss in a second. Tons of coins, numerous coins in all denominations throughout the empire, proclaiming Judea has been taken, Judea capta. It's been conquered. If you look at the surviving Arch of Titus, the relief panels, the southern panel shows that the conquest of Jerusalem was the whole basis of Flavian power. This is Titus's kind of memorial for when he ascends to heaven, when he dies. His brother Domitian finishes this arch for him, and it shows at the top his ascending to heaven on the back of an eagle. But the signal achievement of Titus, which is displayed in striking detail on the southern panel inside, is of course that famous relief, which we'll look at in a second, of the triumph over the Judeans, for victory over the Judeans. Then there was a lost Arch of Titus. I mean, there was an Arch of Titus in the Circus Maximus at the main entryway, which has been lost to us, but it's been excavated in recent years. And its inscription was recorded by a medieval visitor, also saying that Titus was the first guy to have ever conquered this foreign people, the Jews, the Judeans. So the Flavian army defeated Vitellius' army in October, and then Vitellius himself was defeated and killed in Rome on the 20th of December of 69. And the Senate recognized Vespasian immediately thereafter and issued a law confirming his pretty much absolute power. But the Flavians, and this is important, backdated the beginning of their reign, not from 22nd of December, but back to the 1st of July. And they did this, so, Vitellius was still emperor way back then, but they did it because they claimed that the prefect of Egypt, the governor of Egypt, Tiberius Julius Alexander, had independently come to support them and threw his 2 legions in Alexandria behind them. And that was the trigger for their bid for power, right? That's what showed them decisively. There had been other omens of, God, the God's support and things like that. But this was the decisive move that led them to realize it wasn't just them. Vespasian should step up and accept this kind of divinely appointed role to save the empire, because Tiberius Julius Alexander had already administered an oath of allegiance among his legions to Vespasian. So he had administered this oath on the 1st of July, and that began the chain reaction that would bring Vespasian to power. So they won in late 69, and it took Vespasian, for reasons we'll see in a moment, it took him more than a year to reach Rome. He arrived in October, November of 70. And then the next summer only, Titus showed up, and Josephus, by the way, traveled with Titus. And they reached Rome and they had a massive triumphal parade, which was a once in a lifetime, once in a generation at least kind of event. It was a major event on the streets of Rome, parades through the streets, which we'll look at in a second. But here are some paintings, some much later paintings, early modern paintings of the triumph, which became a major event in Western history. As the artists depict on the left here, Vespasian, on the right, Titus in his chariot as the conqueror of Jerusalem going through the streets. So the symbol of the menorah, the big candelabrum from the temple, became central to all this. It's depicted on that arch relief and the Arch of Titus. And the Flavians began to rebuild Rome on the basis of their supposedly foreign victory over this alien enemy. They began rebuilding Rome, and at least 5 major monuments in ancient Rome grew out of this. So, first of all, the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitol, which burned in the civil war between Flavian and Vitellian forces. It burned down in December of 69 in the final push. Vespasian had to rebuild this because it was the most important temple in Rome, right? The Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, Jupiter, best and greatest. So the Temple of Jupiter, modeled there. Then Vespasian's own Temple of Peace, or Pax. And this is where he stored the stuff that he had taken from Jerusalem, the temple furnishings, beautiful gold pieces, the candelabrum, the table, the stuff that was in the inner sanctum of the temple. He stored it there, the beautiful purple curtains, embroidered curtains and things like that. So it was on display and people could come and visit it in the courtyard of this place. And you can, if you visit Rome today, you can still see the kind of large, very large area where this was. There's a road running right through it. Mussolini's road runs right through the middle of this thing now, but you can see it on both sides of the road. The Colosseum, the most famous, tourist kind of icon of Rome today, was built by the Flavians in honor of their victory in Judea. And it's absolutely astonishing, right? The Flavian Amphitheater, better known as the Colosseum. And then down at the south end, it's hidden by that little banner, but I'll show you another picture of it. So the Circus Maximus there on the left is where this other Arch of Titus once was. And then the more famous Arch of Titus that is still standing in a certain way. It was refashioned, but is still standing today. So the one I was talking about in the Circus Maximus is there at the south end. This was a big Arch of Titus. And that's, as I mentioned before, it's been excavated. And so we now have excavators' reconstructions of what it looked like, a triple bay arch as a kind of major entranceway into the Circus Maximus. The inscription, although the structure itself is not standing, archaeologists have found only the foundations of it, but that's actually quite a bit, of course. But the inscription is really interesting, and it was written down by a medieval traveler, thankfully. And so we have it. And what it says is the Senate and people of Rome, for the Imperator, the conqueror Titus Caesar, son of, by this point, Vespasian has died. This is 81 CE, and Vespasian died in 79. So, emperors were thought to be, the good emperors were thought to be deified. They were transported to heaven, and they became gods. So this is for Titus, because by the precepts, advice, and auspices of his father, this is quite interesting, he subdued the Gens, the nation of the Judeans. The city of Jerusalem by all the leaders, kings, and nations before him, either assaulted in vain, that is, they tried to do it, but they didn't succeed, or they didn't even try, he destroyed. So he was the first one, according to this inscription, to have managed to conquer Jerusalem. This is, of course, total nonsense, right? But that's what the inscription says. And so, most people are not educated, they're not literate, they didn't know. And the Flavians simply tried to put it over on everybody that they were the first ones that had actually added this territory to the Roman Empire. And that's confirmed, by the way, by the fact that they were permitted, they could hardly be denied, by the Senate, the right to extend the sacred boundary of Rome. Now, this is called the Pomerium, this sacred boundary, and it's not one of the main walls. It's not an actual wall around Rome. It is the sacred boundary, and it was marked by stones called Cippi or Cippi. It's written in Latin. These are stones about the height of a person, uh, spaced out some way around each other. We don't actually know where they were because only a few of them have been found, but you can see little bits of the line of where they ran. So they're not in the same place as the actual walls, but they mark the sacred boundary. That's the Pomerium, made out of travertine with inscriptions and spaced at intervals. So the Emperor Claudius was the first of the emperors, probably in 49 CE, to have the right of expanding the Pomerium because, remember, he had made Britain into a province. He'd gone over in 43. Well, his army had gone over. He went over for a quick trip to seal things up. 43, 44, and Britain was added to the Roman Empire. And so here's one of the Cippi that marked the Pomerium from Claudius. And what he says there, you can see at the bottom, is that because the Roman Empire was expanded, so he was also given the liberty of expanding the Pomerium. It's a kind of symbolic act that you can make this wall or this territory in Rome bigger because you've expanded. It's like a microcosm of the empire. You've expanded the empire, so you can expand the Pomerium. So Claudius in 49 was the most recent person to do this. He's the only emperor who did it, apparently. There was some idea that Augustus did it, but that's generally not accepted today. So it should be a reward for expanding the territory of the Roman Empire. And when the Senate in 70 recognized Vespasian as emperor, they explicitly gave him a law a few weeks after they recognized him as emperor. They laid down a law that specified all his many privileges and rights, and they included number 5. It shall be lawful for him to advance and promote the boundaries of the Pomerium whenever he wants to do it, whenever he cares to do it, just as it was lawful for Claudius. So Claudius is the model they're looking back to, and they say, hey, he added to our empire, so he has the same right. And we actually have 2 Pomerium stones from Vespasian's Pomerium. He claims there, just like Claudius did, to have expanded the limits of the Roman Empire. So if you see at the bottom there, Auctus PR Finibus, he's grown the limits of the Populus Romanus, the Roman people, and therefore he was able to amplify, expand the Pomerium. So all of this says that Judea had not been part of the empire before. That's what it implies. The Flavians were the first people to do this. And the coins that I mentioned tell the same story. Judea taken, Judea acquired, Judea capta. That's what these coins, and they're in, that's what they say. And they're in all denominations, cheap coins, everyday coins, copper coins, little bronze alloys, and gold coins, silver coins, all of them telling the same story. So you see this image over and over again, the Romans or the emperor standing, or a Roman trophy of armor standing above Judea, Judea looking lost and hopeless, now conquered. Judea dericta, Judea taken, conquered, captured. Beautiful coins, some of them. So here's a coin from the triumph of Vespasian and Titus, right? And that may be Simon Bar Giora. It's been suggested by David Hendon in the front of the procession with his arms behind his back tied up as the procession rolls along, and either Vespasian or Titus there in the chariot. But these symbols are unmistakable, right? They all say the same thing, that Rome has triumphed, and you've got victory, Victoria, riding on this shield, that they did this for the salvation of the empire. And there's Judea, submissive and humbled before. And that coin is from 79 CE. So the very last year. So they kept at it, is the point. They didn't stop. This is from Vespasian's last year. They just kept pumping this message out that the basis of their power, the basis of their legitimacy, their right to rule the Roman Empire, is that they defeated a foreign enemy just when all these other chaps, Galba, Otto, Vitellius, were fighting each other, and Roman legions were killing each other. The Flavians were out there fighting for Rome and fighting a dangerous foreign enemy. I'll stop there for a second. Jacob, any?
We don't have any questions from the audience right now, but I do have one.
Okay.
How do you view the way Josephus talks about the year of the four emperors? Is there any details that you find about it questionable, or does his account of the entire thing seem fine as is?
Well, yeah. One aspect of it does fit very well with Flavian propaganda, and I'll come to that in the slides here at the end. It's the one place where he really intersects with Flavian propaganda against what other historians of the time said, and that's in his portrait of Vitellius, the guy that Vespasian chose to go up against and take on in civil war. He presents him as a total, douchebag, a rotter, a loser, a horrible, nasty, violent, savage guy who needed to be defeated for the salvation of Rome. That's not how any of the other historians of the time present Vitellius. They all give the impression that Vitellius saw that his days were numbered as emperor, and he was willing to give up. He was quite happy to step out of the picture and concede and walk away to private life and save his life. But it didn't work out that way. So Vespasian presents him, apparently. I mean, he has to, right? Because to justify his civil war, he has to present him in the darkest colors, in the darkest hues, as a real danger to the empire that had to be removed. And Josephus supports this picture, but that's the only place where he intersects. You asked, is his picture reliable? Well, the problem is, of course, we don't have Vitellius. We don't know what he was really like. We only have portraits of him. But it's quite interesting that the other historians present him in much brighter colors as a more reasonable chap who was willing to step out of the way. Actually, I'll come back to that towards the end. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the big icon, right? The Colosseum, the Flavian amphitheater. Now, some of your viewers may already know this, but the Flavians created this thing with the boast, apparently, I'll show you why, apparently, that they built it out of the wealth that they brought to Rome from this newly conquered people of the Jews. That's what they claimed. Now, is that true? I think it's very difficult to believe for many reasons, but they claimed it a lot. They were celebrating it everywhere. Even some of their coins had on them the Colosseum, the Flavian amphitheater. And notice that it was fronted by a triumphal quadriga, a four-horse chariot symbolizing triumph. Now, a very bright scholar named Geza Alfuldi noticed when he was doing some exploratory work around the Colosseum, he noticed that there were a couple of fragments of stone that had been reused in I think, 5th century structure. But when he looked at the stones, he noticed that there were patterns of these peg holes. And the peg holes were used to support lettering, right? And he could see that there was like 3 lines. So there were very clear lines. And he began to wonder whether, just using his imagination, if he could line up a little bit like Morse code in a way, but look at the way that the peg holes were arranged and see if he could figure out what the letters actually said by process of elimination. Try certain letters. Would they fit? Would they not fit? And here's what he came up with. That the only letters he could see that really fit, and of course this is only on part of the stone that survived, so you have to fill out the rest, but he thought he could see, so you can see there the A, right, on the left side, the three holes in a row, that looks like an A when you see that, or half of a V, the right half of a V, but something like that, an A or V. So you go by process of elimination. And doing this, experimenting, and on the very far left there, you see an upper and a lower hole. So that would be an I, right? So then he figured out that it most likely said the emperor, Caesar, Vespasian, Augustus, and then that middle line talked about the amphitheater. This new amphitheater was made, and the crucial bit was at the bottom, ex manubis, that is, from the spoils of war. This was amazing, right? So he posited just from the structure of the stone, you see the dressing above and below it, right? The kind of the way it's artistically cut above and below the inscription. This looks like it was a fixed inscription of a certain size, and he argued, he posited, that it was on the exit ways out of each stairway, leaving the amphitheater. You had this inscription reminding people that this was built from the spoils of war by Vespasian and Titus. So it was another boast about their great achievement in defeating the Judeans, right? And he thought he could see that in the top left there of the holes, it's very busy, right? And he thought he could see that the letter T had been inserted afterwards. So it had been begun under Vespasian, but it was actually dedicated by Titus when Titus was ruler. So they had changed just Caesar Vespasian to Titus Caesar Vespasian. Actually, Vespasian and Titus had exactly the same names, but the father went by Vespasian and the son went by Titus, the first name. So it was important to stick the T in there. So Alfuldi thought. Now, not all scholars have agreed with him about this. Some of them think it's a little too speculative. They're not convinced by the peg holes, but most people, I think, have gone with him. So that's quite amazing to think that this great icon of Roman identity, the Flavian amphitheater, was that the Flavians actually boasted, and this would have been around in Josephus' time, even though it wasn't finished yet when he finished his war, but it was just about finished. All of the coinage, the monuments, everything was screaming, we defeated the Judeans, and that is the basis of our power. And otherwise, in Rome, these images abounded. So I mentioned the Arch of Titus. In the Middle Ages, it had become built into the city wall, as you can see on the left. But then under Napoleon and the next pope after Napoleon's removal from Rome, it was restored as a freestanding arch, the way it had been in the ancient world. And on the southern panel, this is an earlier engraving before it was destroyed as it is today. If you look at the panel today, I was just in Rome about 3 months ago, and if you look at the panel today, much of it has been effaced, by the weather and environmental conditions. But this engraving shows it pretty clearly from some centuries back, 3 or 4 centuries ago. And you can see much more clearly what's going on in the relief. And here, the procession is heading under an arch, and you see in that arch on the top right side, you see a double quadriga, right? Vespasian and Titus each driving a chariot with 4 horses of triumph, and that's symbolic of the arch they're going under, and they're carrying all the temple vessels. Those placards that are empty would have indicated what it was, telling the audience, watching, what these things were. So there's one right in front of the menorah would be saying, this is the menorah. This is the golden candle stand from the temple. Then the golden table at the front, it has a placard right in front of it, right? And then the one at the back is running off the picture. So, and you have all of these soldiers and sacrificers carrying this stuff, featuring it in the triumph. And there's how it looks more or less today. Not nearly so clear, obviously, but clear enough that you can see what's going on, right? So that was in the building already, the Arch of Titus, probably in the building around the time that Josephus was finishing. It wasn't yet completed. As I said, Domitian would finish it off after Titus died. And other arches in the city that are no longer existing were dedicated to Vespasian and Titus immediately. So already during Josephus' time there, but they're lost to us. Something that isn't lost to us, discovered in 1848, is the so-called Haterii tomb relief. Now, this is the richly decorated tomb of the Haterius family, and it was sort of activated when the wife passed away, and the husband put a lot of decorative stuff in there at this time, honoring his deceased wife. Now, it's clear from many of the reliefs in there that the family was involved in construction, and they lived during the Flavian period. So these 2 images there show construction equipment and what they were doing. But then there's a 5-foot-long panel that features 5 Flavian structures, and it seems that the husband was in a part of a firm or a lone engineer or something that was involved in all of these constructions. And in each case, they reflect, we're not always sure exactly what the structures were. Actually, there's been a lot of scholarly debate about which structures they are. But what is clear is that they all feature in some way the theme of victory, military victory over who? Over the Judeans. Armed victory. So, for example, again, here, just as on the coins, you see that the Flavian amphitheater had a triumphal quadriga at the front of it, right? It's all about victory, all about beating the enemy. This one, it's an unknown arch. It may be the Arch of Titus, but look at the top of it. It's showing victory, the quadriga, right? The horse-drawn chariot of victory. Then you have another arch, unknown arch, possibly the Arch of Titus. But here you have the goddess Virtue with her foot on the helmet of the enemy, and the goddess Victory, Victoria, and the god Mars, god of war, all celebrated there. Then you have the temple of Jupiter, the sustainer, who is he receives temples vowed during wartime for victory. So all of these structures are about that. And if you look at who the defeated enemy are, right up along the top of the first structure is this image here. And you can see, if you look carefully at it, the palm trees and the prisoners with arms bound behind the palm trees, right? And that is always a symbol of Judea. You can see the four horses in the middle there, the quadriga, and then the prisoners with their hands behind their backs and Roman armor and a palm tree. And this kind of imagery is even found across the Mediterranean in Libya, in the city of Sabrata. This is a structure now here from 200 CE, from the Severan period, but a cuirass, a piece of armor, carved armor, was found that most scholars think had the head of Vespasian on it for various reasons we can't get into. But anyway, what's interesting is the imagery on it as well, is about prisoners with hands bound, right, looking lost, victory writing on the shield, just like on the coins, victory writing about the conquest under a palm tree, right? So it's again the Judean victory being endlessly celebrated. So that's context one that I wanted to point out. So this is what Josephus's Rome is all about. It's heaving with claims about the Vespasian and Titus having defeated the Judeans and added them to the Roman Empire, right? Now, as for portraits of the two, I can do this very quickly. I'll just cite a couple of examples here that we can do this very quickly. I won't bore you to tears, I hope. Just to give a context of what other writers were saying about the Flavians, because this is important, of course, for evaluating what Josephus says about them. Here's what famous other writers say about them. So the elder Pliny is writing the same time as Josephus is in Rome, and he's widely respected as a very practical, shrewd operator, very wise guy. He's not a flatterer by any means. And yet, look at how he begins his natural history. He dedicated it to Titus, most pleasant imperator, an address that suits you in consummate truth, while the title of greatest ages gracefully along with your father, a triumph, a censorship, the consulship 6 times, tribunician power, all this for the Republic. And then he goes on to say that Titus just works tirelessly for other people and says, he exclaims, "Oh, great fecundity of spirit of Titus." Well, there's nothing like this in Josephus, but nobody blames Pliny, or nobody says that Pliny was a shameless flatterer of the Flavians. After the Flavians are long gone by a couple of decades or 15 years, Tacitus, who's famous as a very kind of jaded, cynical historian, still he writes of Titus, his inner nature equal to the greatest good fortune and the beauty and majesty of his countenance, Vespasian's great successes, the oracles that told of their rise to power, even chance occurrences that incline people to see omens in their rise. All of this he talks about in his Histories, Book 2, at the beginning, 2:1. Then he goes on to say about Vespasian, he was a keen soldier who would, march at the front and always showed his great skill. He personally went the rounds. He was, a great, great general. And the character of Titus was fully equal to him in these regards. Suetonius, writing about this is like 110 CE, so Titus is long dead. He's been dead for 30 years now. He introduces him as the love and darling of the human race. Such was his capacity for winning the favor of all. All of these writers talk about omens of the Flavians' rise to power. Josephus has none of this stuff. Then there are the Flavian poets who really go over the top. For example, Silius Italicus writing about the Punic Wars, but he has Jupiter, God Jupiter, predict that godlike excellence shall come from Vespasian's birthplace and soar to heaven. A warrior family reared on the berry that grows in the Sabine land shall increase the fame of the divine family of the emperors. So Josephus has none of this kind of stuff. Nobody, however, calls these other writers flatterers or sycophants. Only Josephus, for some reason, attracts this designation. But Josephus has nothing like it. On the contrary, he explains in the beginning of his war, he just says, everybody is flattering, naturally, the imperial family. They weren't there, they didn't see what happened, but they're trying to portray the Romans as just wonderful and great, and they always belittle and humiliate the Judean side. So I'm going to set the record straight. And Josephus' account is not about flattering the Flavians, it's about trying to portray the Jewish side, how the war looked from the Jewish side. And this is my final section then, Jacob. Saying how did the Flavians actually appear in his war? This is the third context that is necessary for understanding him, and this is where we get to what he actually says in context, in his own context, and it's important, to get the big picture. So first, a quick overview of the main points. He's writing, as I just mentioned, against all these others, these hacks who just flatter the current regime, as of course they would do, right? They want to be thought well of by those in power, so they flatter them. And as a byproduct, they denigrate the Judeans and put them down. So Tacitus also talks about, even as he kind of flatters Vespasian and Titus, from his remove, he talks about the historians who, during the Flavian family's rise, composed the chronicles of that war, have, in the distorted representations of flattery, assigned, they've said that the Flavians were motivated just by love of country and a regard for peace. That's all they really wanted. And Tacitus, being the jaded historian he is, says, there's more to it than that. These guys were after power. But he recognizes that there were flatterers of the Flavians in writing histories, and that's exactly what Josephus says. Josephus picks up on the same thing and says, I'm not doing that. I'm going to tell you the Jewish side, how it looks. So he always writes as a Judean statesman, although he is a Roman citizen by this point. He never mentions this in his War or Antiquities, that he's a Roman citizen. He only writes as a Jewish statesman, priest, aristocrat. Now, by way of overview, the Flavians don't even appear until nearly halfway through his war. So it can't be described as a work that is about them or flattering them. The first part of it is all about the Hasmoneans, King Herod, the origins of the war. None of this involves the Flavians until nearly halfway through. And the book thereby undermines crucial Flavian claims. He's actually opposing, quietly, politely, but still opposing, undermining, removing the ground from crucial Flavian assertions. For example, Book 1 features Pompey the Great when he annexed Syria back in 64, 63 BC, including Jerusalem. And he'd already held a big triumph in Rome. And Josephus describes his capture of Jerusalem, which was the real capture of Jerusalem for the Roman Empire, back 120 years before the Flavians came on the scene. So it cannot be the case that they were the first ones to capture Jerusalem. He also points out and makes a big deal of the fact that Pompey did not touch the sacred temple vessels. He was too pious a man to do that. He actually entered the temple, which was kind of scandalous, but when he saw what was there and all the wealth, he backed away and said, no, no, I can't touch that. That's sacred property. So he didn't. But of course, the Flavians did. I mean, that's all they got actually out of Judea. That's what they featured everywhere, was the temple stuff. So there's an implicit, at least there's room there for some kind of questioning about the Flavians, right? He also narrates the general Sosius recapture of the city. So it simply cannot, in 37 BC, to help King Herod take his throne. So it cannot be the case that the Flavians were the first to capture Jerusalem. His double-length first volume of the war emphasizes also the good Asmonean and Herodian relations with Rome, the cooperation they had with Augustus, for example, and even before Augustus, Julius Caesar, and before him, various Roman strongmen. So again, the relationship with Rome has been around for hundreds of years. It's not something the Flavians created. Herod's father, Herod himself, his sons were all close friends with Roman rulers. Herod became Mark Antony's close friend, then Augustus and Marcus Agrippa, a century before the Flavians. And his big point is that Rome has ruled Judea in peace all this time, and Jerusalem has prospered under Roman rule. So all of this kind of completely undermines the Flavian claim. He wants to say that the recent war against Rome, was not a fundamental conflict, therefore, between Judea and Rome. It was because of the malfeasance of Nero and some of his officials. And of course, everybody hates Nero now in the 70s, in the Flavian period. And he's saying it was only with Nero, and Nero was really, erratic and broke the mold of Roman governors. That's what the problem was in Judea. And it was a policing issue within the province, because Judea was part of the province of Syria for all this time, for more than 100 years. So it's not like it could have been added somehow to the empire. His account undermines and actually excludes the Flavian claims of a new heroic conquest. His kind of deadpan description of the triumph, he doesn't offer, explicit criticism. Obviously, that would be very unwise of Vespasian and Titus, but he does expose its kind of fraudulent character in quiet ways. So how does he portray Vespasian? Well, Vespasian only appears in 4 blocks of the war, not very much. He's gone by the end of book 4, and he only appeared in book 3 to begin with. So again, when he describes his activities in Galilee, he's not introducing Vespasian to an audience, which we might think, if we pick up the war and look at it, we might think, oh, he's trying to tell us who Vespasian was. No, everybody knows who Vespasian is. He's the emperor, for heaven's sake. Everybody knows that he's a tough, brave guy, no nonsense fellow, very wry sense of humor. Everybody knows that in Rome. Josephus doesn't have to say that. Rather, he's using Vespasian and his greatness to highlight his own greatness. Because remember, Josephus is the guy who was stuck with leading Galilee when Vespasian arrived with his army. So he's trying to say, well, I gave it the best shot I could. I was in a hopeless situation trying to fight this guy with his major, professional army. So he's using Vespasian to highlight his own brilliance. He manages to trick and delay Vespasian for over a month in the town of Tapeta, where he surrenders. One of his men even injures Vespasian with an arrow, very perfectly located, hits him in the foot, throwing the Roman army into panic. So he's boasting about what he was able to achieve and how he held off even this great Roman army for more than a month. In his story of his surrender, moreover, he portrays Vespasian as a liar. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Vespasian is a liar because all generals are liars. That's the whole point of being a general in the Roman world, to deceive your enemy and to make them think you want one thing when you actually want something else. Josephus himself tells lies and is boastful about it. I lied to these guys. I deceived them and then I tricked them, you know. But he does the same thing with Vespasian. So he says that when he was hiding in the cave at Yotapata, Vespasian promised him safety and sent a man over to call out to the cave, "Come out, come out, Josephus, you're safe." Vespasian thinks you are a really brave guy, and he wants to take you, safely into captivity. You won't get hurt. Don't worry about that. Vespasian just admires you. He thinks you're wonderful. And Josephus says, "I didn't believe this for a moment because I knew it wasn't true. He'd want to kill me. Obviously, I gave him such a hard time. He would kill me." So he didn't believe it, and he didn't come out. And he only came out in the end because God promised him, he felt that God promised him safety and God would take care of him. He didn't trust Vespasian at all. And once he arrives in the Roman camp, he says, "It was only Titus who saw my pathetic condition." And he's about the same age as Titus, a young man. Titus was the main factor in securing his safety from his father. So the point is, Vespasian would in fact have killed him. That was what he was going to do. But Titus stepped in and said, "Dad, come on, can we save this guy? He's a really young man," and so on. And he persuaded Vespasian reluctantly to spare his life. When Josephus says his famous prediction, he actually says, "You are the real Caesar," because Vespasian then wanted to send him, according to the story, to Nero, right, to give him Nero an account of his actions and let Nero decide, because he's the emperor, what to do with him. And then this Josephus comes up with this, famous prediction. He says, "You want to send me to Nero? No, 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 no. You are the real Caesar here." Vespasian doesn't believe it, right? He sees it as just a ploy to save Josephus' skin. So he says, "Yeah, you're just a worm trying to save your life." But he yields to Titus to spare his life and keeps him in chains. So what I'm trying to say is Vespasian doesn't come across here as any great admirable guy from Josephus' point of view. A little later in the story, same thing, true to form. Vespasian is in Tarichea in Galilee, and in order to persuade the people who have been captured there to cooperate, he promises them safe passage. He says, "Come out and you will be escorted safely to Tiberias." But then he has them all arrested. He kills the weak among them, and he sends the fit ones off to slave labor in Corinth on Nero's canal project he was trying to build at Corinth. So he just violates his pledge. He just lies. Then Vespasian, he describes Vespasian at Gamla in the Golan Heights, and he just completely bungles this situation there. Titus is away visiting Syria, northern Syria, and Vespasian just wants to get this over and done with as quickly as possible, unlike his usual manner, which is to go very slowly and risk-free. But he's out in the middle of nowhere with his army, and they have to forage for food, and they don't have supply lines or anything. So he just wants to get this over. And he's got a massive army. He thinks he can overrun Gamla, so he sends his army in. They go busting into through the wall in Gamla, but they find themselves trapped in this very steep town going uphill, and the residents are on the top of the hill chucking stuff down at them, rocks and stones and boulders and shooting arrows. And so they actually lose quite a few men trapped in the narrow little alleyways of this town, and they have to back out the way they came in. And it's kind of a disaster. And Josephus recounts this in quite a bit of detail and says that Vespasian was leading the charge, and he himself lost awareness of where he was and got himself trapped at the top of the hill. So again, he doesn't come across as a great hero. He is a tough, brave general, but that's what you expect. And that's a given. Everybody already knows that about Vespasian. But the way Josephus portrays him, there's nothing particularly, you know, heavenly about him or godlike or anything like that. He's a very human being who just kind of deceives and lies and seeks opportunities to achieve his ends. When it comes to the third phase of, or sorry, the second phase of Vespasian's career there, he goes to Judea and Perea, and there he kills tons of innocent people, and his general Placitus goes around terrifying everybody and chokes the Jordan River and the Dead Sea with corpses of innocent people. Josephus says that Vespasian went around burning empty villages and killed some 10,000 innocent stragglers, women and children mainly, who couldn't get away fast enough. Again, there's no heroism here and no real battle. His last statement about Vespasian in Judea is, "The strong fled, the weak perished, and everything left went up in flames." So the strong got away, the weak died, and all their property went up in flames. That's Vespasian's big achievement in Judea. Then he goes and visits the Dead Sea, and Josephus, in an amazing story, says Vespasian was curious about what he'd heard about the Dead Sea, that everything floated in it. So he ordered that a bunch of guys, we don't know who they are, maybe soldiers, who didn't know how to swim, would be tossed in the deep part of the lake with their hands tied behind them to see if they would float. That's his way. That's his way of testing whether the lake really holds up or not. And it turns out they did float. But you get the impression that he would have been just as happy if they didn't float, because he's just a tough and callous guy. But it's not a very flattering story in any kind of moral terms, right? He just throws people who don't know how to swim into the lake with their hands tied behind them. So they might drown. But happily for them, they float. Now, Josephus' account of his rise to power is the most intriguing part of this whole thing, and it really raises questions for the Flavian propaganda. Certainly, there's no conquering hero here of the Flavian myth. It's not like that at all. So here's how the story goes. When Vespasian hears that Vitellius is in power, according to Josephus, he begins to rage impotently, however. He's totally impotent. I mean, he can't do anything about it. He just goes ballistic. It's like passive aggression, I think we call it. He's raging inside, but there's nothing he can do about it, right? Why? Because he thinks, well, it would be too dangerous for me to bid for power, and it's too far away. I'm in Judea. It's over in Rome. Lots of bad things could happen if I tried to challenge him. And it's June at this time, and Josephus has the odd remark that he doesn't want to travel in winter because it's too dangerous. Now that's really strange, because it's not winter at all, actually. It's the peak traveling season for sailing. Anyway, travel in winter was perfectly common. Vespasian had traveled to Judea in winter, and Titus had traveled across the Mediterranean in winter of 67 to get there. I went to Egypt and picked up a legion there. And others have traveled in winter. It's not so weird to travel in winter. But Vespasian decides, nothing I can do about it. I just am fuming. I'm torn up that this guy is in power. And Josephus' language actually says it was churning him up inside, but he kept his rage under control. Well, it's not a very heroic picture. So what happens is the initiative comes not from Vespasian, who prefers a private life, but from his soldiers. And it's not from Tiberius Julius Alexander in Egypt, as Flavian propaganda said. Rather, it's the initiative of Vespasian's own soldiers in Caesarea. And it's It's from their own pride that they think they are superior to Vitellius's soldiers. So they should be the privileged guys to be the emperor's, army. So they want to have a better position, and they force Vespasian, they force him to step up to the plate. They stick their swords at his throat and threaten to do away with him if he would not live in a worthy manner. Man up, grow up there. Claim your right to be emperor. You've got an army behind you here. We'll support you. But they're doing it for their own self-image, self-worth. They want, and their own advancement financially and in other ways in status. In this account of Josephus, Vespasian then, after he's convinced that if he doesn't do it, they're going to kill him, he says, okay, I'll do it. I'm resigned to do it. He writes to Tiberius Julius Alexander over in Egypt because he realizes he needs his support and begs for his support. So this is now well after 1st of July. It's not independent support from Tiberius Alexander. It's Vespasian's request, would you please support me in this because my soldiers have, prompted me and I'm going to make a bid for power. Tiberius Julius Alexander, who is an old friend of a network that involves Vespasian, says, yes, okay, I'm happy to do it. But it's a response to Vespasian, not an independent move on his part. Finally, Vespasian doesn't, so the army has chosen him to lead them against Vitellius, right, on the field of battle, because he's the great commanding general. And he says, you know what? I think the better idea is I'm going to go and wait in Alexandria, right? How about that? And here's the plan. Egypt sends a lot of grain to Rome. So we're going to starve out Vitellius. We're going to withhold Rome's grain supply from Egypt. And then the people of Rome will become so upset with Vitellius that they will kill him. They will get rid of him. Now, this is amazing, and it's a completely implausible strategy, of course. Egypt did supply some grain for Rome, but only about a quarter of its annual supply. And to think that by withholding that, it would cause a revolt against Vitellius in Rome, and that's a lot of ifs, and not a very plausible strategy. Well, up to a third of Rome's need. It wouldn't force his abdication. And finally, he decides, according to Josephus, you know what? Okay, that's not such a good idea. We do need to go and fight. We do need to go and fight Vitellius's army straight up, face on. Now he forgets all about winter when it actually is winter approaching by this time. And he sends his friend and aide, the legate of Syria named Mucianus. He sends him to fight Vitellius' forces. And now it really is, autumn is approaching, and Mucianus goes overland to reach Rome with his army. So Vespasian's still going to sit it out in Alexandria, and he stays there until all the fighting is done, right? And he will only go to Rome almost a year. He promises to leave as soon as the winter's over, but he actually won't. He won't go there until everything is calm and settled in October, November of 70. Now the soldiers again had acclaimed him imperator, triumphing general, in order to lead them against the enemy, but he doesn't. He stays safe. So my point is, you see, Jacob, I hope that where I'm going with all this, that this is Josephus's account, written from his own perspective, and it's really not mouthing what the Flavians said about themselves in any way. Shall I stop there for a bit, or?
Yeah, I do have one question before you continue. So why was it that he said that they don't want to go over there because it's winter, even though it wasn't. And then when winter came, winter's not a big deal.
Right. Winter's never a big deal. If you need to go somewhere, you go. That's just how it is. So it's really odd, right, that that he actually writes this for Vespasian. Looks like a warrior, right? He's just a guy. I don't know, man. Yeah, I can't go. I really hate this guy, Vitellius. He's got to go. I can't stand him. He's bad for the empire. But bad weather. It's a long way to go. My point. He sounds very human. I mean, I'd probably feel the same way, but I'm not a great hero, right? I'm not the emperor. So it's not my point is, it's not a good look, right, for the emperor, I think. It's still polite. I mean, he's not outright accusing Vespasian of anything. It's just that one could raise an eyebrow to reading the story if one were so inclined. It's definitely not a heroizing version of Vespasian, I think. You see what I mean?
Yeah. Jay, thank you for your super chat.
Is there a question from the super chat? Or
No, you just give a thumbs up.
okay. His triumph description. This is quite amazing as well. So Josephus was there. He was in Rome when the Flavian triumph took place. And again, this is a massive parade, big procession through all the streets of Rome. And he describes it in elaborate detail. We don't have time to read his whole thing, but if anybody's interested, it's book 7 of the war. And it's the only eyewitness description we have of a triumph. And it's really worth reading if you're interested in it. I mean, we have later descriptions of Republican triumphs, but they are by later writers who are probably depending on good sources, but they're quite a bit later, like Plutarch and others writing about 200 years before or 100 years before. So Josephus is writing an eyewitness account. And what's interesting, and I've quoted just a couple of bits from his account here, and I've highlighted them, as you can see, because they convey his emphases about what he saw in the triumph. So what did he see? What produced the greatest amazement was the construction, right? So this is all, here's the point. It is supposed to be where you bring all the wealth, the riches of the conquered territory to Rome and put them on display, right? Because the conquering general wants to show the people of Rome, look, this is what I've done for you. I've brought for you like masses of exotic jewels and wealth and minerals and gold and money and silver pieces and exotic designs and statues and marble and all kinds of stuff I've brought to you, or even exotic animals from some countries, right? Or that kind of thing. That's what you're supposed to do in a triumph. But what the Flavian triumph was filled with, according to Josephus, was homemade stuff. there's virtually none of that other thing. So we have accounts like in Plutarch of the earlier Republican triumphs. Some of them took 3 days because just filling the wagons with the wealth of Egypt or Syria under Pompey, it just took a huge amount of cartage to display all the stuff that was brought. But Vespasian and Titus, although they were accorded 2 separate triumphs by the Senate, Vespasian said, "Nah, let's do it in one day." And they're going to combine all their stuff. And even still, it's all homemade, or almost all homemade stuff that they just pulled out in Rome or built in Rome to show pictures of what they had done in Judea. Right. But so Josephus says, what produced the greatest amazement was the construction that held up the scaffolds, because on account of their size, there was alarm over the unconvincing stability, that is, They had these massive scaffolds built up with tapestries on which they portrayed what had happened. For many of them had been built to 3 or 4 stories in height, and the luxuriousness of the construction was intended to generate pleasure, albeit mixed with terror. On many of them were woven carpets with gold, and all were framed in carefully wrought gold and ivory. Where's the ivory from? It's not from Judea, it's from Egypt. By means of various artistic representations, the war, now all divided up into segments, produced a vivid spectacle running from one scene to the next. On display were a prosperous countryside being ravaged, entire phalanxes of the enemy being killed, some running away, some being taken captive, walls of great height and thickness being wrecked by Roman machines, the strongest of fortresses being stormed, the most populous city compounds on tops of hills being seized, an army pouring inside the walls, every place filled with slaughter, the hands of the impotent raised in supplication, fire engulfing temples, temples, plural, the destruction of houses on top of their owners, and after much wasteland and gloom, rivers flowing not over cultivated land, but through a land aflame on every side. For the Judeans committed themselves to the war, and so they had these sufferings coming. That's the Flavian claim that justifies this complete destruction. Now, the problem is, of course, that none of this, what's being portrayed, matches. This is in book 7 of the war, the last book of the war. He's just been telling you in great detail over the preceding 3 volumes what actually happened during the war. And the pictures don't match what happened. Like, for example, there are no cases of phalanxes of Jewish fighters, right, squaring up against Roman fighters. The Jews didn't have a professional army. They didn't have an army at all. They didn't go out into the field to fight against the Romans. That was like the Macedonian army, the Macedonian phalanx. So it's recalling previous armies that fought the Romans, right? And the Romans beat them from 2 centuries earlier, where there were professional armies that faced down the Romans, like the Carthaginians or something like that. But that's not the Jews. That has nothing to do with Josephus' story. And where do these multiple temples come from? Everybody knows the Jews only have one temple. Where are all these cities being attacked with, fierce fighting going? There's nothing about that in Josephus's account. So if you read this triumph story in its context, if you read it as what the Flavians claimed happened over against what Josephus has authoritatively told you happened, you can see it's a complete sham. It's a complete fraud. And he just describes it. He doesn't make any comment. He just says, this is what they said. This is what they portrayed as happening. This is what they're celebrating, their great victory. They just made it up. It's not actually what happened. Houses collapsing on top of their owners, all of that stuff. Fortresses being stormed. No, there was one fortress in Jerusalem that was stormed, and then the Romans had a big setback and had to give it up again, the Antonia fortress. And then they tried a second time, and they finally overcame it. But that's the only one. That's just not how the war went. According to Josephus' account, it was all about everybody fleeing their villages for Jerusalem, right? And then Vespasian just marching through with his army, his cavalry, burning empty villages and killing women and children who were running, who didn't keep up with the flow. So it was the triumph is a complete and utter sham. So to summarize, I've said Vespasian declines an offer of a separate triumph Why? Well, because Vespasian, imagine for a moment if Vespasian had held a triumph for what he did. He didn't do anything. It's only Titus who has the stuff to display, right? And we know for sure that what was featured, all the evidence indicates what was featured in the triumph. The only thing they really got from Jerusalem were the temple vessels. And that's all Titus, right, from the siege of Jerusalem. So Vespasian could have just pulled, brought some like lumps of dirt or something from burned timber from empty villages. He didn't have anything to display. That's why I think he said, "No, I'll share with Titus because he's got the good stuff, the gold from the temple." You're supposed to have a triumph, just like extending the pomerium is supposed to be for adding new territory. That's also why you hold a triumph. You bring new wealth and territory to Rome, but they just didn't have any of that. Judea had already been allied with Rome for 130 years. So almost everything in the triumph was made in Rome or was borrowed from elsewhere in the East, and they'd already brought it to Rome a long time earlier, like ivory from Egypt and other parts of Libya, Africa. Josephus' war contradicts the portraits on the tapestries. There were no rivers. There are not rivers everywhere in Judea. There's only the Jordan River at the eastern end. There were no enemy phalanxes or well defended cities or temples on fire. And here's the crucial point: if Nero had not sent Vespasian, if his legate Cestius Gallus, whom we haven't talked about, but he was the governor of Syria who first tried to settle the disturbances in Jerusalem, if he had succeeded, there would have been no possibility of a triumph because it's just a police action within a long established province. You can't have a triumph for that. So Josephus Vespasian, in short, is a very wily dissembler, a deceiver, a clever, cunning fellow, a manipulator who knows how to get ahead and inflate his possibilities, take advantage of opportunities. That's Vespasian. He's a very clever, wise guy. His son Titus is a totally different character, and part of what I want to stress is that if in the Flavian poetry, for example, everybody becomes a hero, right? We saw that in Silius Italicus, like, these divine beings come out of this place that the gods have chosen. But that's not Josephus' portrait. Josephus' portrait is of two very human beings, very human characters, and very different from each other. Right, so they don't have heroic qualities. Vespasian is Vespasian. He's a tough guy. He's a, no nonsense guy. He's a cunning guy. A lot of shrewd street sense. That's Vespasian. His son Titus, on the other hand, as often happens, right, when you have such a father, a domineering father, the son is completely different character. Very gentle, overly trusting, gullible to a fault, opposite of Vespasian. He has his own faults that go with this kind of character. And because time is short now, I'm just going to quickly run down and give you a basic picture of how I see Josephus' portrait of Titus. I think he likes him. He appreciates him, respects him, but he portrays his relationship with his father this way, that I would offer the analogy of kind of training wheels, that his father wants to groom him for power because he knows that his own claim to power will rest on having a successor, right, that people like. So he tries to put Titus in the position. He's already, Vespasian has already done everything he needs to do militarily. He was already Claudius's general in conquering Britain. So he's already achieved for himself, lots of military glory. That's settled. But Titus is the one he needs to groom. He needs to prepare and make him look like a credible successor. And the way he does that is very shrewd. He gradually gives him increasing responsibility while Vespasian stays nearby to, pull his chestnuts out of the fire if need be, to help him and back him up with decreasing support and increasing distance from him, leaving him more and more responsibility. So here's how that plays out. He gives him, I would say, a series of 6 increasingly demanding tasks while Daddy remains nearby. So the first one, of course, is he gives him command at the very beginning. When he goes to Judea, he gives him command of a legion. He's only 27 years old, and he gives him the 15th Legion of Apollinaris. Normally, a legionary command is given to a senator who's already held the office of praetor, and the qualifying age for that office is 29. Titus is only 27, so apparently has not been a praetor, and this is a special gift from his father, being allowed to command men who are much more senior to himself, right? And they've got much more experience. So that's the first thing. Second thing is when they get to Galilee, it's a kind of a cute story, actually, in Josephus. The story is that Trajan, who's the father of the future emperor Trajan, he's the commander of the 10th Legion. The 10th Legion Fretensis is a very famous Syrian legion. And he has been sent by Vespasian to go and calm down a little village called Jaffa, which is across the valley from Iltapata. And when the people of Jaffa saw what was happening in Iltapata, how they were being squeezed and looking like they were going to be killed, they launched a little protest of their own. So Vespasian sent Trajan with part of the 10th Legion to go and suppress them. So Trajan shows up and gets everything in order, surrounds them, and he knows he can just walk over the place. And he's all set to do that. And what he does is he sends word back to Vespasian and says, look, I think it would be nice. He's just flattering Vespasian. He says, I think it would be nice if Titus came in and did the coup de grace here, right? That he can take the glory for this. I don't need the glory. Titus can have it. So why don't you send Titus down? And he sends Titus with a small force of cavalry. And Titus nearly blows the operation. It's all set up for him. It's a slam dunk. But he takes control of it. And the Josephus account is actually quite funny. It says they march into town and the women left in town start throwing like pots and pans at them and things like that. And the soldiers are unnerved by this. And Titus just makes a complete hash of it. And Trajan needs to rescue the situation to actually put down this little mini rebellion in a very small town. So that's the second operation. Third one is one I mentioned before, when Vespasian goes to help King Agrippa II with his towns of Tiberias and Tarichea by the lake. He settles Tiberias himself, Vespasian does, and then he sends Titus with a force of 600 elite cavalry and says, why don't you go up to Tarichea, just an hour's walk to the north, and take this big cavalry force and tell them to hand over the troublemakers there from that town, intimidate them. Well, Titus goes, but he's a bit worried. He's scared. So he requests more cavalry, and Vespasian says, okay, you can have another 400 I'll send as backup. And he has finally a little small victory, but Josephus says he indiscriminately kills people in the town because he's nervous, and he just starts killing people left, right, center, even innocent people. And Vespasian has to complete the hard work. And this is where Vespasian chases people who flee onto the lake in boats. He has his men, so he jumps back into the picture, has his men construct rafts to go and chase those who have fled on the lake, the Kinneret Lake. So this is a good example of how dad is there in the background, coaching the son, saying, you do this, you gain the military experience, but I'm there to back you up. And he does, and he steps in, helps him out. Then I mentioned Gamla, in which case it was a very odd situation because the roles were reversed. Vespasian, in the absence of Titus, tried a quick assault on the town, which he totally botched and lost a lot of soldiers. So he backed out of the walled town. And then Titus returns and saves the day by a stealth operation. He says, no, let's take it by night and let's try some more clever smarts here. Let's undermine part of the wall and then, scare them and send in a small team rather than just sending in the whole army, which is going to get all, bottled up in the walls. So he does, and he saves the day. So he's gradually gaining confidence. That's the picture that you get. But the next story is that Vespasian says, okay, you've done so well. Here's now what's going to happen. We're finished in Galilee. I'm going to take the entire army and head south. It's now October. I'm going to head south to Scythopolis and Caesarea by the coast for winter quarters. I'm taking the army with me, but you can have 1,000 cavalrymen. I want you to go and visit the few northern towns we haven't looked at yet. And one of them is Giscala. And this is where John of Giscala, who will become a crucially important leader in the siege of Jerusalem on the Jewish side later, this is where he's based. And Titus's job is to go and check him out and see, what he's about and whether he needs to arrest him or whatever. So he goes to Giscala and he totally blows it. He goes with 1,000 cavalry. And the story is simply that he arrives apparently on a Sabbath already. It's unclear whether he arrives Friday afternoon or Saturday afternoon, but anyway, it's Sabbath pending. And he realizes that he could easily overrun the town. He's got 1,000 cavalry with him, and the town probably only has, 1,000 or so people in it. And he could overrun it. He could grab John of Giscala, the leading guy there, if he wanted to. But here's what happens. John outwits Titus, and that's Josephus's language. He says in Greek, he outwitted him. He outwitted Titus. How? He said to him, Titus, I'm totally with you. No problem. I'll go with you. We'll give up the town. You can put in a garrison here. There's absolutely no problem. But you can see Sabbath is approaching. And, you're a nice guy. You respect the laws of the Jews. And so why don't you just, wait until the Sabbath is over? Because we're not supposed to conduct any, negotiations or do any work on the Sabbath. So why don't you just wait until Sabbath is over? I promise you we'll come with you. We'll do everything you want after the Sabbath is over. Josephus says that instead of camping around Giscala, then Titus decided, okay, yeah, you're right. So I'm going to take my 1,000 cavalry and we're going to go to a comfortable town nearby called Kedesa or Kedesh, which is actually like 10 kilometers away. And we'll stay there for the night. We'll come back and we'll deal with this after the Sabbath. Well, he comes back next morning. The Sabbath is finished. And guess what? John's gone. John and his cronies have fled south to Jerusalem. And now Titus has to send a party after them. They can't catch up with them because they've got many hours on them. And so John makes it to Jerusalem faithfully because he becomes one of the two major leaders of the defiant siege against Titus. So how does that look for Titus? Especially since Josephus has told you John outwitted him. During the siege of Jerusalem, there are a number of incidents which we won't go into, but Josephus describes Titus's gullibility. He's just a very nice guy. He's personally brave, like he puts himself in trouble, but that's partly because he has to keep rescuing his army who never obeys him. They never do what they're told to do. And so he has to keep rescuing them and getting into the situation himself. So Josephus does talk about his personal bravery, but it's not exactly a good look for the great triumphant Roman army. And he keeps getting fooled. Like, for example, when the Jews who are being besieged in the city set up a couple of ruses to try to trap Roman soldiers. And in one case, uh, Josephus says Titus fell for it, and I had to restrain him and say, no, 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 no. This, because by this point Josephus has been freed, right? And he's there translating for them. So he says, no, no, they're tricking you. And notice that the siege of Jerusalem still takes place while Vespasian is around. He could have done it himself, but he left it. And this is quite interesting. He didn't think it was that big of a deal from Vespasian's point of view. It was an obvious thing they were going to take Jerusalem. They'd taken the rest of the region very quickly without much resistance. And so he was sure they could take Jerusalem, but he left it to Titus. And what Titus does is he tries carrots and sticks, right? So he tries every once in a while, he parades his army to try to intimidate the people of Jerusalem. And when he sees that they don't capitulate, then he moves a step farther forward and tries to, tear down another wall of Jerusalem, moving gradually forward. But what he really wants to do is intimidate them into surrender. So Vespasian stays in the east. He doesn't go to Rome. And he could have actually stayed long enough and done the siege himself. But it seems that he wanted Titus to receive the glory for this, what he considered a very manageable operation. Titus made heavy weather of it by his, very slow approach. And he also sent Tiberius Alexander, the prefect of Egypt, who was near Vespasian's age and very experienced, as Titus's executive officer in his kind of second in command to manage the actual day-to-day operations. So Vespasian was heavily involved, as the inscription said. Remember, by his father's advice and under his father's auspices, he took the city of Jerusalem. Nevertheless, Titus does appear personally brave, even reckless, but he remains totally gullible, fooled by enemy tricks, and has his life saved by Josephus. So he's a very different character in Josephus from his father. And I guess my main point is that they're really human beings in each case, right? And each of them has the faults of that type of character, right? Vespasian has the faults that go along with being a brash, know-it-all, streetwise, brawler. Titus has the faults that go with being a very gentle, well-intentioned, humane, uh, gullible kind of guy who's able to be fooled quite easily. If you were to say that Josephus flatters them, well, how about this? He gives each of them a completely opposite strategy in dealing with Jerusalem. So in book 4, while Vespasian's still in the picture, Jerusalem, he discovers, is in internal turmoil as as outsiders are flooding into the city, and the group we usually call zealots, I call them the disciples, I think is a better translation of the Greek, doesn't matter, the zealots, killing off the nobility within Jerusalem. There's a terrible civil war going on inside the city. And reporters come, or defectors, or whoever, informants, tell Vespasian about this. And Josephus says this: all his other commanders, Vespasian's commanders, considered the civil strife among their enemies a godsend. They said, we should attack. This is, God has arranged this for us. They claimed the provision of God by turning their adversaries against each other was their ally. We should strike now while they're all in turmoil. Vespasian, however, declared they were making a serious error. They were obsessed with making a display of their skills and weapons, but this was fraught with danger. He's very risk averse. They're not thinking about security and advantage. If he were to rush against the city immediately, he would be responsible for unifying the enemy, because, once the Romans showed up, they would all come together to resist us. Whereas if he waits around, he'll have far fewer to deal with because they'll kill each other. So he says success with repose is more beneficial than the precarious way with the weapons. Let's not bother fighting them. Let's just wait and they'll kill each other and then we'll go and pick up the pieces. We don't need to fight them. It's foolish to go and fight them. Maybe that sounds wise, right? Sun Tzu, something like that. Let them all kill each other. But a bit later, in the next volume, very similar situation when Titus is at the gates and he sees that they're all fighting each other. But now Josephus says of him, it did not seem to him proper for such a large force to sit idle, though it was also superfluous to engage in battle those who were killing each other. So you realize that it's pointless to go and, us to kill them when they're already killing each other. But he thought he had the reverse view, in other words, of his father. And he was anxious that his reputation for success would be diminished by a considerable lapse of time, which is exactly the view of Vespasian's commanders, right? They all wanted to strike. And Vespasian said, no, you're just after fame and reputation. You want to be credited with a great victory. That's exactly the view of Titus here, against his father's wisdom. For although everything is accomplished in time, yes, it would happen. Speed is of the essence for fame. If you want to be famous, you got to strike quickly, get it done, right? So if you did hold the view that Josephus is flattering the Flavians, which of them is he flattering? Because he gives them two completely opposed kind of strategic pictures. Which one is the flattery? Well, we come to the final episode now. This is where Josephus has been thought most obviously to flatter Titus, and this has to do with the destruction of the temple and Titus's role in it. So remember that central to Flavian propaganda is Titus' destruction of the temple. That's the whole thing, right? That's what's being featured back in Rome. The spoils of the temple being displayed. Vespasian puts them in his temple of peace for everybody to see. They are the centerpiece of the Flavian victory. So contrary to scholarly tradition and popular impressions, there's no hint at all that the Flavians felt any guilt about this. They needed saving from their main achievement, or that they were embarrassed about it. Rather, they were endlessly celebrating this. The temple spoils, as I said, were the main thing that they were displaying in Rome. So the view, however, that Josephus was their lackey assumes that they were embarrassed and that therefore Josephus is trying to kind of save Titus's reputation. He didn't really want to destroy the temple. That's what Josephus says. He didn't really intend, he didn't wish to destroy the temple. But if the Flavians were actually proud of Titus's unprecedented achievement, Josephus is undermining their central claim to have destroyed the temple. This is very clear from what he says. He says, first, the Judean God used the Romans to purge the temple for God's own sake, because his temple had been polluted by Jewish groups killing each other, shedding blood of compatriots, their own people, in the temple spaces, right? And Titus tried to save the temple. God actually ordered the temple destroyed, not Titus. So his account is that Titus first orders the temple gates burned to facilitate the entry of the legions, right? Because he's going to destroy the whole city. Then he orders the fires put out so that the legions can actually get in to the temple. But he decides at a meeting of his commanders, he has a meeting of his commanders, a concilium, and says, all right, what do you all think we should do about this world famous temple? In that meeting, according to Josephus, he decides that it's in Rome's interest to preserve the temple if possible, because there are Judeans everywhere throughout the empire, and they will respect that if the Romans have managed to preserve the temple while subduing the problems in Jerusalem. But according to his account, a soldier inadvertently sets it alight while returning fire from the rebels inside. So this soldier is trying to put out the fires as Titus ordered. And then people inside the temple are shooting arrows outside at the Romans who are cleaning up. And this soldier shoots a flaming arrow back at them. This flaming arrow hits a storehouse where there's lots of dry goods, and that begins a fire in the temple. That's how the fire begins. Titus, however, is having a siesta in Josephus' account. He's gone, he says everything's in order. They're putting out the fires as I ordered. And so I'm going to go have a nap, as you do in often Mediterranean countries. So he has to be awakened and told, hey, the temple's on fire. You didn't want this to happen, but it's on fire. And this is Josephus' own account, his own words, well, translated from Greek. Jumping up just as he was, undressed, maybe, he ran toward the sanctuary to extinguish the fire. All his commanders followed close behind, and the much excited legionaries were following them. Although Caesar used his voice and his hand to signal the fighters to put the fire out, they neither heard his shouting nor paid attention to his hand signals. Some distracted by combat, others by their rage. Once the legionaries joined in, it was all over. Neither exhortation nor threat could hold back their charges, as fervor was the only general. He was no longer the general, but their own emotions were their general. They had taken over. When they were close to the sanctuary, they pretended not even to hear. They pretended not even to hear his orders and encouraged those in front of them to add to the fire. Caesar, when he found out that he could not hold back the charges of his frenzied soldiers and the fire was taking control, went inside with his commanders, supposing that the structure might still be saved. And this was correct. Josephus says he tried to persuade the soldiers to put out the fire. He instructed Liberalius, a centurion, to beat the disobedient men with clubs to restrain them. But the men's fury and hatred of the Judeans overcame, sorry, that's a typo there, overcame their respect for Caesar, overcame their respect for Titus, and fear of the man who was trying to stop them. So they were no longer afraid of their general. They were more driven by their emotions, by their passions, and this is how the sanctuary went up in flames against Caesar's wishes. Now, I would put it to you that there is no way, there's no way that this is a flattering pro-Flavian portrait of Titus's greatest achievement. He's out there waving his arms around, screaming at everybody. They're paying no attention to him. And so his greatest achievement in burning the temple is said to be not his achievement at all. It was something he absolutely didn't want. He's too nice a guy. So that's the end of my picture, Jacob, of Josephus' portrait of the Flavians. But the last quick point I would make, and just returning to something I said at the beginning in answer to your question, how does he portray the year of the four emperors? Ancient writers agree that Vitellius was a glutton and a hedonist and a weak and sad and vile guy by character. But once he's established as emperor in Rome, that's not how they portray him. He did execute many enemies en route to Rome, but he wanted good relations with the Flavians. Vespasian's older brother, Flavius Sabinus, was Vitellius's urban prefect. That is, he was the officer in charge of the city. And he kept Flavius Sabinus and Domitian, who was also in Rome, Vespasian's younger son, kept them completely safe. And he wanted to get along well with them and work out a deal with them. So when he saw that his army had been defeated up at Cremona by Mucianus and the Flavian force, he accepted the Flavian victory and now just wanted to be a private citizen free to leave Rome with his wife and his young son. So he made a deal with Flavius Sabinus to hand over the city to him and leave. But his soldiers wouldn't let him do it, according to these other accounts. And they forced him to stay to lead them because they saw him as their only hope, right, against the Flavian forces. They thought if he leaves, they're done for. So he stayed and met a tragic end at the hands of the Flavian forces. It's only Josephus who portrays Vitellius, quote, as thirsting for noble blood on account of his innate savagery, right? This is Josephus. He says that he emerged from the palace gorged and drunk at the last and was led off to execution as a tyrant. This is not the account in all these other historians. So Josephus' source here likely is Flavian propaganda, and it fits with the Flavian claim that the Republic needed to be rescued from the terrible tyranny of Vitellius. And it costs nothing for Josephus to take the Flavian view here. It doesn't, interfere with his own Jewish account of the war. Maybe it also would help to distract the Flavians if they saw that he agreed with them on this crucial point about how awful Vitellius was. That would help to, kind of muffle his implicit criticism of the Flavians and many other issues and his undermining of their claims. So I come to my conclusions. Josephus is generally still considered, not by specialists in Josephus, but otherwise by other historians and popularly, as though he were in the pocket of the Flavians. But my argument is this is because he's read without the historical context of Flavian Rome or his own literary context. That view is based on circumstances, assumptions, and some weak proof texts. If we read it in context, as I've tried to do here in a sketchy way, we see that he opposes the Flavian boosterism right from the start. He says he's writing his war against those accounts, pro-Flavian accounts. He wants to correct the imbalance and mainly to show the great character of the Judeans as tough and virtuous people. He's a proud Judean statesman, and he writes from that point of view as one who virtuously fought against Vespasian and therefore knows both sides. He does not, true, overtly criticize the Flavian rulers. Of course, that would be immensely foolish for someone to do that. But he does quietly undermine many of their crucial claims about Judea. He portrays Vespasian and Titus in realistic, human, non-heroic, polite ways. Vespasian, shrewd, calculating, tough, takes good care of the army, highly risk averse, sits out the wars, both in Judea and in Rome, and takes care to groom Titus, who is much more sensitive, compassionate, gullible, but personally brave, even reckless at times, young man. So he is not, strangely enough, he's not as flattering as Tacitus, Suetonius, the Flavian poets. He has no omens of their rise to power, nothing like that. But perhaps his harsh portrait of Vitellius helps to cement his link with the Flavian perspective. Many were eager to tell the Flavian story of the recent war. There were lots of them already by Josephus' time of writing. He tells a distinctively Judean story of this great conflict. Okay. That's it.
Kathy Brocato, thank you for your super chat. Dr. Mason's a brilliant scholar. Thank you for having him on. Everyone should read Dr. Mason's Early Christian Raider.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for that super chat, Kathy. And I agree. What did 2nd century CE Roman historians generally think about Josephus's relationship to the Flavians? What were their views on the matter?
We don't know. That's a good question, Jacob. But we absolutely just don't know. They don't talk about it at all. if you saw Josephus as a pro-Flavian author, he might be included in Tacitus' remark, that, but he doesn't fit the description, because Tacitus says, remember, that the pro-Flavian writers all said that Vespasian came to the rescue of the empire when it was in danger. That's not Josephus's view at all, really, as we've seen. Um, he didn't want to, and it was his soldiers' self-interest that forced him to take up the cudgel. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how they would have seen him, actually. But what we do know is that, and this is interesting as part of an answer to your question, what we do know is that they saw him as a Jewish author, as a very Jewish author. Second century, third century, and especially fourth century, with Eusebius and Pseudo-Hegesippus, who quote from Josephus a lot. It's very clear that to them, he's a really, really Jewish author. Yeah. So that's quite interesting, because that perspective got lost along the way. By the time modern scholarship arose in the 19th century, people began to see him as very much a Roman, a Flavian mouthpiece.
I want to go back and talk a little bit about the Aramaic Josephus that Josephus was talking about. Do you think that was a full history or of the of the Jewish war, but not the entire war, of course. Well, maybe it is, maybe the entire war. But what do you think it was exactly that he wrote in that text that he's talking about?
Well, I'm glad you asked this question. It's a really good one. So a lot of people have treated the Greek war as basically a translation, right, of this Aramaic. But the curious thing is that when he later writes about writing the Greek war, he makes no mention of an Aramaic version at all. And he describes in both his autobiography and in his Against Appian, he describes his writing process when he wrote the Greek war, and there's no mention of any Aramaic. So here's what I think. I think it's most likely that it's just let's think of an analogy. If I am really interested in a subject and I write I write reports about it, I write to friends, I write to those who are interested, and then someone asks me to write a proper history or proper connected account of it. I might say, I don't know that I would, but I might say in the introduction, well, actually, I have written my views about this to lots of people before, and I'm reading all kinds of other pictures that I don't agree with at all. So since all these other people have, had the benefit of my truthful account, my accurate account, I'm going to now tell you what I've said to them, but I'm actually putting it in a proper format. I think that's kind of what Josephus is doing. I don't think he had written an account of the war, as such, a history. I think what he means is that when he was still in Judea, he was a priest, aristocrat, and so he had many connections in the Parthian Empire, across the Jordan River to the east, way out in the Iraq, Iran area. And those people would have contacted him as a priest, not him alone, but others, and asked what on earth's going on. And he had given them updates, he'd given them reports. And he now finds himself in Rome, where everything is reversed, right? He's just reading everywhere. He's not only reading, but he's going to visit, he's going to hear people recite accounts of the war that he just thinks are bunkers, crazy. They're all so slanted toward praising the Roman leaders and vilifying the Jews, of whom he's one, right? And he's insulted by this. And he says, come on, this is crazy. So I'm going to tell you folks, because I am one of the few people who have seen both sides of this. I fought against the Romans at first, then I was captured, I was in the Roman camp, and I was at the siege of Jerusalem from the other side watching from Titus's side. So I can actually see both sides. I'm going to now tell you all what really happened, and as a kind of rhetorical flourish, he says, I already told lots of people, and it's crazy that these remote people far away in the Parthian Empire should know the truth about what happened, while you here in the world capital, where the Judean war is such a big deal, you don't know. You've been deprived of the balanced truth, proper picture of what happened. So I'm going to, yes, I'm kind enough to, extend myself and write for you the truth about what happened. That's what I think is going on. I don't think he's at all saying, I'm now going to translate an Aramaic history that I already wrote. I don't think that's what he means.
And why do you think that Josephus exaggerated certain accounts of the war, like saying that there was many temples, multiple cities are under attack, including fortresses as well, when there's really only one nearby?
I don't think he's exaggerating. I think what he's saying is, this is what the Flavians said. I think what he's saying is that they portrayed all this as if they had overcome this, great enemy of armies and temples and, a kind of landscape that would make sense to a Roman audience. That's how they portrayed their victory, but it's not true. It's not true at all. Josephus has made a big deal of the fact that the Jews only have one temple. Um, that's what his whole work is about. So you couldn't believe the Flavian story if you've read Josephus. But I don't think he's exaggerating. I think he's describing the fraud of the Flavian triumph. And he doesn't need to pause and say, this is a fraud, because he's already described in great detail what actually happened in the preceding volumes, right? And it would be foolish for him to stick his neck out and accuse the Flavians of mass manipulation of the evidence. He doesn't need to do that. Any intelligent reader ought to be able to see that their portrait in the triumph doesn't match the truth, doesn't match what he's been telling you as a reliable, authoritative historian.
AGC, thank you for your super chat. Does Dr. Mason have any idea why Tacitus makes no mention of Josephus in his account of the Jewish war in the histories?
Yeah, very good question. As you know, then probably with such a good question, the crucial part of Tacitus' histories is lost, right? So he says at the beginning of book 5 of the histories, I'm going to talk about who the Jews are and their traditions and their culture, so to speak, because I'm about to describe the fall of a great city. But that's lost. It's fallen out of, and I suspect the reason it's lost is because we have Josephus. So the people who were copying Tacitus didn't feel any need to copy that part. Usually, the way this worked in the ancient world was you have sort of one major historian for each period in each place, right? And that person rises to the top and the others fall away. So I suspect that what happened was Josephus' account knocked everybody else's out of the water, and only Tacitus only survived in the preliminary part, where he gives a different account of Jewish culture. But I'm not so sure that he doesn't reflect Josephus. He doesn't name him. Suetonius names him, Cassius Dio, but not Tacitus. But I think it's quite, shall I use the word likely? I think so. I think it's likely that he actually borrows from Josephus, because if you look at his account already a bit in 5:1, but especially in 5:10 to 13, it closely maps Josephus's distinctive account. So what do I mean by that? For example, Josephus gives 7 omens, not of Vespasian's rise to power, but of the destruction of Jerusalem. So he says in Book 6 of the War that there was a series of omens that God showed that the Jews should have known from these that Jerusalem was in trouble. And these include like a cow giving birth to a lamb, the temple gates, which usually took 20 men to open, massive temple gate, opened of their own accord one night. There was a vision in the sky that everybody could see of armies fighting, clashing in the sky. These kind of things. These are the omens of the city's destruction. Now, Josephus gives 7 of them. Tacitus has several of them in the same order. And these are not things that actually happened, right? I don't think anyone would say the cow did give birth to a lamb or there were contending armies fighting in the sky. These are Josephus's construction, but Tacitus has a number of them. And he uses an almost exact verbal formulation. It's in Latin. He's writing Latin, of course, but if you would back translate it, it looks almost exactly the same as what Josephus says. And it is that there were these ambiguous oracles, ambiguous, two different ways you could read them. And the uninformed took them to their own advantage and saw them as promising good things and didn't realize they were omens of destruction. That's almost verbatim from Josephus. And there's several other bits there about the famine, the way it went, the burning of stores, things like that, that suggests to me that he borrowed from Josephus. Of course, Tacitus does not name his sources generally. He's following in that Thucydidean tradition of writing history, where you just basically say to the readership, trust me, I've researched this, I know what I'm talking about. But he does say at the beginning of book 5 that, many people think this and many people think that. So clearly he's read a lot of different accounts, but he doesn't tell you who his sources are. And so I think it's most likely that he did actually use Josephus as a source, also for his later account of the destruction of Jerusalem, and that the most obvious reason why copyists didn't preserve it was because they already had the real thing in Josephus. I hope that helps.
So basically, let's say one day it gets found at some point in the future, lost work by Tacitus, you would probably expect it to look most likely the same as what Josephus basically said.
No, not necessarily. No, I should clarify that.
Okay.
I think Tacitus is, far too independent an author to, he's just a brilliant writer and historian to just slavishly copy someone else's account. I didn't mean that, but I did mean that. Well, 2 things. One is that I think it's most likely if he borrowed Josephus for this earlier stuff, he would have borrowed from him for the main account of the war. But then second, that copyists generally only needed one main account of a big period or event, and they tended to treat one as authoritative and the others fell away. So, for example, we know that Justus of Tiberias also wrote an account of what happened in Judea. We know that because Josephus gets angry with him and criticizes him. But we know his account survived until the 9th century because Photius refers to it, the patriarch Photius refers to it, having read it, but it didn't reach us. So I think that what happens is, it's pretty clear that what happens is generally, one historian for a period becomes the go-to person. You can see this in the 2nd century among Greek and Roman historians and other writers with Aelius Herodianus. And he writes in the time of Marcus Aurelius around 160s. And he's writing about words and their meanings and definitions and all kinds of trivia. And whenever he writes about Judea, he defaults to Josephus. He just says, this from Josephus. He's the guy for this. So you can see that happening. So that's all I'm suggesting, Jacob, is not that Tacitus' account would have mimicked Josephus or, just copied it or anything like that. No, I think Tacitus would have disagreed with it. He would have brought in other authors. He would have shaped his own account to carry his themes. But since Josephus' account existed, and it was a much fuller, more detailed eyewitness account, and had some kind of support, from the Flavians. Apparently, that's what Josephus claims in his autobiography. That Tacitus just fell by the wayside. Now that doesn't explain everything, because also a big chunk of Tacitus' annals fell by the wayside. The middle part of it. So we don't know all the reasons why, but I think that's one reason.
I want to go back to the 67 CE when Josephus surrenders and to the Flavians at Jotapata. What do you think of his account of that when the other Jewish soldiers that are with him they're killing each other off one by one, and then Josephus is supposedly the last guy standing, and then he comes out of there and he surrenders. What do you think of his account?
Yeah, well, it's just an account. I mean, we have no. It seems very artificial in many ways. Like it includes a big speech, right, against suicide, which seems rather artificial. It's a very philosophical speech. Would you really give such a speech at an occasion like that? I don't know. I think it's unlikely. And it's a very literary kind of speech. So I think we can say with some confidence that Josephus, crafted all of this after the fact. And part of his point is to show how resourceful he was. He says that my resourcefulness did not fail me at that time, and I came up with this scheme. But part of it makes fun of himself, right? He said, well, sort of. He says, I persuaded these guys to this idea that we would cast lots, and then the guy who received the next lot would kill the person next to him, and that sort of thing. So it's not actually suicide; it's a group, self-killing, an agreement to kill each other. And then he says, and the problem, of course, would be with this system, with the last two guys remaining, right? Because it would be, he says, it would be, I forget his word, but it's like an abomination. It would be awful. It'd be terrible if those two guys decided, you know what, let's not, let's not. But that's exactly what happened, right? He and one other guy are left till the end, and he says, I persuaded the other guy, let's not do this, and they didn't. So it's just a strange story. You know probably that mathematicians have come up with this thing called the Josephus problem of because the premise of the mathematicians is he must have calculated some way that he could survive all of this. So they come up with a system of where he would position himself if everybody's killing the guy next to him to the left. But of course, that doesn't account for what he says happened, which is that they drew straws. So he wouldn't know where to stand in that case. But anyway, yeah, there's lots of room for suspicion, and all we have is his account. All I can say about it is that it's self-serving, that it's but not in the way it's often taken. It's usually taken as his what can you say, his cover up of something awful that he did, and I don't think that's the case. I think he writes this account to boast of his resourcefulness, And whether I guess he's kind of winking at it. He was in an awful situation. Whether people would actually kill themselves, um, want to commit suicide or virtual suicide in that case, I think is it's one of these sticking points where we, comfortable, middle class, bourgeois, modern, comfortable people can't imagine that happening. Why would we all want to kill ourselves? But I think in ancient context and even in modern context in wartime, when you're really stuck, this just happens a lot. People do resolve to kill themselves rather than face what they perceive to be, the tortures and the humiliations that will await them. And he says, I knew the rule that a general should die rather than be taken captive. So we don't know, we don't have any other evidence for such a rule. But again, the fact that he propounds it, he's the one, he's in total control of this story. That's my point, I guess. So I don't think that we should use it against him as if, oh, look what he did, that was shameful. Well, no, he's telling the story and he's kind of crafting it to look good in some way. So I don't think we can use it against him because we don't know what happened, actually.
When Josephus mentions that Vespasian is the one that the oracles or the prophets foretold to be coming, what do you think he meant by that? Because there are some that interpret that as Josephus suggesting that Vespasian is the Messiah. But what do you make of it?
Yeah, no, I don't think that at all. And the part of the problem here is that we, again, comfortable sitting in our studies with all these electronic tools for searching texts and reading them, even in book form, flipping pages and stuff. This wasn't possible in the ancient world. So a work like Josephus's War was not in a book; it was in 7 rolls, written with script that had no word breaks in it. A continuous script, and in 7 different rolls. So, the experience of reading Josephus, most people would have heard it being performed, being read out, and they wouldn't be putting together. So the reason I say that is what scholars have done, being very bookish people, is we grab a line from book 3 where he surrenders, and we put it together with a line from book 6 where he's talking about the interpretation of a passage in scripture, and we say, aha, these 2 things, this is all one thing. And he was saying that Vespasian was, he went to give his prediction to Vespasian because he thought that he was the guy who would rise from the east. I think this is not good method. We should read each story as his audience would have heard it, because he's trying to communicate to them. He's trying to tell them a story. So if you just look at his surrender story, it's not actually a prediction in Greek. It's often translated that way. So the Loeb translation, for example, when he goes and has his audience with Vespasian, he says in Greek, "You are Caesar," not "you will be Caesar." You are Caesar. So the situation is, again, Vespasian wants to send it to Nero because he's the emperor, he's Caesar, right? And Josephus, remember, has just been to Rome recently, and he was shipwrecked and nearly killed. Most of the people on his ship died. And he says he managed to hold on to some flotsam or whatever and then swam a lot in the nighttime. And he and a few others, well, relatively few, managed to survive. But most of the people died in the shipwreck. So, and that's in peacetime. He wasn't even a prisoner, right? He wasn't in chains or anything like that. And shipwreck was a very common experience in the first century. We know that partly from all the shipwrecks that have been found, but partly because of all the references to shipwreck in Roman literature. So it's a perfectly reasonable thing that he would not wish to be sent as a prisoner. Now, remember the Apostle Paul, right, was also shipwrecked as a prisoner, according to Acts, on his journey. This is really common. It's not so unreasonable that he would be facing Vespasian, who's now 56, 57 years old, a mature, accomplished soldier, commander, and he's going to send him to young Nero, who became emperor at 16 and is now in his 20s and is, just I don't know what pejorative term to use that would reflect the ancient view of him, but a kind of a flake, right? He goes off on this artistic tour of Greece for a year and a half, and that's where he is now, right? So middle of 66, yeah, so late 67, he's still on his artistic tour of Greece. And the idea of being sent on this perilous journey to go and catch up with him, this very erratic guy, it makes kind of sense that Josephus, just as a life-saving measure, forget about scripture, forget about messiahs and whatnot, just to save his skin, would say, you want to submit to Nero? No, you're the man, right? You're the real Caesar. Actually, there's a precedent for this. Just a few years earlier, while Nero was governor, just really a short time before, there was a great general named Corbulo, and he arranged to send the Parthian king, the guy who would become the Parthian king in Armenia, to have him go and receive his diadem, his thing fastened around his head, from Nero in Rome. And the guy didn't want to go to Rome. And he couldn't believe, because this is even a few years before, so Nero's that much younger. And he's looking at Corbulo, who's like, I think in the 60s by this point, a very, accomplished commander. And he says to him, why is he the emperor? Like, you should be emperor. You're the accomplished commander. You're the real, you've got the real stuff, right? Why would I go to him? So there's a kind of a parallel there that just makes common sense, that Josephus would try to save his life by saying, don't send me to him. I'll be here. I'll stay by you. I think you're the man. So I would see that as one kind of stratum of this, right? Separately from that, Josephus says the reason that he surrendered to him was that he'd been reading scripture and he got special insight into it, and somehow could see that Vespasian was going to be the ruler and Titus after him. Okay. Maybe that insight came later, when Vespasian was actually willing to bid for power. Who knows? But because he's writing much later, right? The thing in book 6 is totally different. There, the situation is he's saying that the common people and the rebels misunderstood things in their own favor that actually said something completely different. So he says that they read this, they read a passage in scripture about a ruler rising from the east, and they took that as great comfort for themselves, thinking that one of them would be a world ruler. Well, that's nonsense, Josephus says. That's just talking about Vespasian, because he was, acclaimed emperor in Caesarea, in the East. So that's what that's talking about. But there's nothing in there that suggests that Josephus believed in a Messiah figure of any kind. I don't think he did. There's no evidence in his 30 volumes. He never talks about a Messiah. That's just not part of his thinking. So I don't think that he does. He's just saying that we smart people knew how to interpret this stuff, and that's just simply a reference to Vespasian's being acclaimed emperor. But no, not a Messiah. That's a long answer, Jacob. I hope it's coherent enough.
And in my closing question, what do you make of Josephus being adopted into the family as a Flavian? Why do you think that happened?
Yeah, that's not such a big mystery. It's a good question, and it's one that deserves to be understood well. It's just that when you're a slave, so you when you are a slave, or in the case of a prisoner, the emperor's or the commander's slave, you're in chains. When a slave is freed in Rome, and this happens frequently, Rome was known for a very kind of liberal practice in freeing slaves. Many Jews had gone to Rome as slaves, and according to Philo, they'd virtually all been liberated, so they'd become freedmen. So they had the status of former slaves, now freedmen. According to Josephus, Titus intervened to make sure that he did not have the status of a former slave as a prisoner, because he'd made this statement about Vespasian, so he could be kind of useful for them. So wouldn't it be better if he didn't have the status of a former slave? Anyway, the point is, when you become freed and you belong to this owner, this patron, you take on their names. So if you were a Greek slave and you only had one name, like I don't know, Heracles or Spartacus, if you're freed from slavery, you take on the first name, like Titus Flavius, the first name and the family name of your master, right? So we know him as Titus Flavius Josephus, but he only ever refers to himself by his Hebrew name in Greek as Joseph. That's all he ever calls himself. He never calls himself Flavius Josephus, and certainly never Titus Flavius Josephus. The reason we think he had this name is that later Christian writers from the 2nd century who refer to him call him Flavius Josephus. And since we know that Titus Flavius Vespasian, and Titus Flavius Vespasianus Titus had the same name, and then Titus Flavius Domitianus was the other son, and the other brother was Titus Flavius Sabinus, right? So that we know that the family name ran with Titus Flavius, right, as first and second name. So if he's known to later writers as Flavius Josephus, that's how he was known in Rome. So his Hebrew name was tacked on as the cognomen, the third name of the three that a citizen has. It's just the normal process that when he would be freed from being a prisoner by Titus Flavius Vespasianus, he would take on those names. That would be his citizen name. But there's no big deal in it. As I said, he never even refers to his Roman citizenship, except in the final lines of the autobiography, where he's talking about the favors he received from different rulers, building up his own character that way. He says one of the things that Vespasian did was he granted him Roman citizenship. That's the only reference in all of his writings to his having Roman citizenship. And he never calls himself by a Roman name.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Steve Mason.
Hey, it was my great pleasure. I realize I went far, far longer than I had intended to, but I hope it was useful on the theme. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it was fun. And thank you for coming on.
Okay, great.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe
and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.